you for the vibe.
Hey everyone, it is great to be with you. I'm here with the wonderful Charlie Malcolm.
Hello.
It's been awesome to have him be part of our conversations. We've looked together at the book of James, and Dr. Justin Smith. It is great to be with you.
Nice to meet you.
We're going to dive right in because there is so much to discuss. As we keep saying, basically every verse of James is very relevant and applicable. And so we're going to continue looking at the end of chapter 1 today, and we hope it's a good discussion for you. So starting in verse 19, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And it's just a mic drop and we could all leave. Because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. This right here is an unbelievably, I think, profound word for today's moment. That you should be quick to listen and slow to speak, I think is such a profound thing for all of us. And right now, I think it's increasingly difficult to live in this space and to find ways to not let things make you angry. I think specifically of COVID-19 and anti-vaxxers and vaccinations, all these things. Like there's just stuff that's very much in the air, and things that are like debated. And for me, it's been interesting to just find out that even people that I love, like they don't necessarily think the same way that I do about stuff. And it's just interesting. You're like, oh, whoa, I wouldn't necessarily have seen that. And I think one thing that's really hard about our world today is you find out something about somebody, perhaps who they voted for or whatever, and then because of that one thing that you know, oh, I now know these next 15 things about you. And that's what I think we all can fall into, and we wouldn't want the same to be said true about us. Perhaps, we support a different way of thinking on one issue, but that doesn't mean that we all just support all these other 20 things. It's just a way of viewing each other that I think is really problematic, and we don't necessarily foster spaces for listening anymore. And we, I think, like the idea of something like diversity more than we actually like diversity as it comes to listening, actually sitting amongst people who are different than us.
Yeah.
And actually creating communities where, I'm going to be offended sometimes by somebody, and I'm going to continue to show up to that community and not just walk away from it right when it gets a little bit hard. And that's something that I think is important for us to think about. And this one is a really important passage. And be slow to speak.
Yeah, I think it is really cool. At least this past year, we got to experience with the racial reckoning, or that was last year actually, over the summer, and just to see people, for like a lot of people, the first time to just be like, look, I don't have any experience. Please tell me about your experience as a Black person, or a person of color, or a woman of color, and just to like sit and hear this experience in a way that is like it felt like very much embodying like this kind of passage, being like, I want to listen and hear from your experience because I know that I don't have this background of information, and like I might not ever be able to understand, but I'm taking the steps to work towards that. And I think that was like a really cool experience that I think that a lot of people just like, it is a very counter thing to do. It's not like with just like the advent of social media is like everybody always has something to say, and the idea of social justice often is taking a moment to speak up. But I think this passage specifically helps to highlight there are moments to also listen, and I don't think that those two ideas necessarily are counter to each other, as opposed to they're both tools. And I think that James is like really highlighting listening, at least in this moment, as like a very powerful tool that could really help Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really powerful thing, I think, here where James is working through anger. It's funny, I think we're going to do more discussion of Greek in the first 3 lessons that we've done here on James, and we probably did it all in Mark. But this word for anger also means wrath. It's like this righteous indignation, retribution. So it goes beyond, I think, even that sort of typical frustration that we may have or anger that we feel on a day-to-day basis. It's this interesting way, maybe even what James is saying is like, yeah, maybe this feeling is coming from a legitimate place, right? But what you're doing is injustice. Because my other pet peeve in the New Testament is there's a Greek word, dikaiosune, that's oftentimes translated righteousness, but it also means justice. And he says here, your anger, your wrath does not produce God's justice. It also assumes that we can be righteous without doing justice when we translated righteousness. So to me, the two go hand in hand. We can't be in the right relationship with God and the wrong relationship with everyone else. And being in the right relationship with others is justice. That's what justice is, right? And so there's this thing like, don't speak, listen, slow down, intentionality, right? Because all this anger that you have isn't producing justice. And I think there's something really powerful in that. I'm not good at any of this stuff. I mean, I tell students this all the time. I speak clearly, I speak forcefully. I speak in a way that makes it sound like I know exactly what I'm talking about. And sometimes I do. Oftentimes I don't. But just because I have a clarity of what I think James is saying here doesn't mean I'm particularly good at it. And so I think we have this challenge as disciples. Do we dumb down the language? Do we make the language fit our circumstances, or do we allow the language to challenge us to be different? And I think James is drawing us into being different in the world.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
It is, and I think this slow to speak. I think in the way that we live today, and I find it fascinating that people will accuse Christians of being, it's just too judgmental of a community or whatever, and that is warranted at times and fair. But let's be honest, we're the most judgmental people, I think, in human history. We are judging things so quick. There's just information flying at us at a speed that we've never had before. And we are reading just the titles of articles and not the actual article. We're posting memes and saying oh, this is it. This is it on this subject. And it's and we believe that we have the right way to communicate. Part of this is digital communication, because there's things that you would say digitally to somebody that you would never say to their face. Mm-hmm. I learned early on in my ministry, don't write an email when you're angry. If it's going in, there's some all caps in there, just stop. Just stop. And don't and walk away from the computer. I was thinking at one time about starting, I think it might be $1 million idea, but an email that you can actually click send, but it doesn't actually go anywhere. Send it here before you send it there. Just that you actually get the glory of clicking send, but then you wake up the next day and you maybe take a shower and thought about it.
A 48-hour hold on your email.
So now we have burner accounts. Yeah, but I totally, and it is, to me, one that I'm thinking of specifically where I kind of did that again. I learned very soon that it was not a good idea, but I think I still was right in that situation, but I didn't act correctly. It was not righteous in how I handled it and approached that problem. And so I think in this world where we just have the ability to just snap off our opinion at the click of a button, I think we all need to just learn to breathe a little bit and to understand that even reading, somebody's comments or posts or whatever, if you're having coffee with them, it'd probably be a little different story. It would be just it just changes it, and like the fact that we can be kind of around each other all the time digitally. There's something about like embodying, like being amongst people that changes the tone of the conversation, and we need to sometimes like really just give that some thought and let things breathe a little bit, because it just doesn't produce good things in us, doesn't produce good fruit. And I feel like this could be a mantra for our day. Just be quick to listen. Like, just, you don't have to get your opinion out there on everything all the time. It's okay sometimes to say, yeah, I don't think I'm gonna agree with my aunt or my uncle on politics or whatever. Okay, I'm just not gonna go down that road. I'm not gonna argue. I'm not gonna go that way. And it's easy sometimes to kind of ruminate over those things. James is, I think, very similar to Proverbs. Proverbs has a great line, like, a dog returns to vomit, a fool returns to folly. And I think there's some roads that we go back down because, I don't know, there's a little bit of that anger that feels good at first. And it's easy to kind of keep returning to this stuff that is not helpful. And you know it's not helpful, but you keep doing it.
I do want to say, though, because like I've heard this verse like forever, repeat it all the time, but I've definitely seen this verse be used as a crutch to people to not speak out when they need to. And I'm like, keep in mind, James is literally saying all these things that are very impactful to us as he's saying that. But he's like also saying like, but also there's a time for everything. Mm-hmm. And I think that we should just always remind us is like, but like, remember, it's like, these are Christians, they are putting their lives on the lines to go and speak about this very absurd idea of that a person raised from the dead and now this is who we should be following. It's like they're performing bravery in other ways and
Definitely
doing things like that. So I just want for anybody out there to be like, oh great. It's like, yes, be slow to speak, but also in the way it's still speak, like be intentional with your words.
Definitely. I think there's the idea of speak softly but carry a big stick, that just you need to say important stuff, and sometimes you're going to need to like speak up, like you said. And it is really vital and important that we sometimes have that moment, but I just don't think that moment can be every day all the time. Like, we sometimes need to slow down a little bit and like hear from important voices, but it's also important to recognize that you can't just fight every battle out there and fight everything. Like, sometimes you need to be intentional and be a little more specific, and understand that if you're in a moment of anger, like heated passion, it might be the time to step away for a minute and just really think about it. Is this really worth it? And a lot of times it might be, okay, no, this is worth it. I need to say this thing. I can't sit on the sidelines on this anymore, whatever that happens to be. But it sometimes it's going to be that. But I just think it can't be that all the time.
Yeah. If it's right, it'll be right tomorrow. It'll be right the next day, right? Yeah. And sometimes it takes stepping back a little bit and saying, is this right? Because I think it's easy for us to be in the moment, to be caught up, right? To be in the heat of the thing, and to say all of these things. And also, too, even thinking about saying all of these things that are right, but said in the wrong way, right? So it's not even just, am I saying the right things? Yeah, the information is correct. What you are saying is true. What you are saying is right. But there's no love here. There's no justice here, right? This is not building up. This is not bringing a community together. It's tearing somebody else down in that potential too. So it's finding that really odd sweet spot that very few of us ever do, of saying the right things in the right time, in the right way, right? It's rarely do we get all of that, right? It's the right things in the wrong way at the wrong time, the wrong things in the wrong way, you know. But there is this sense of then of encouraging us to be thoughtful, right? And to be thoughtful in our challenge even to one another, which is hard. I mean, it's really hard.
Yeah.
I'm prone to spicy language. I'm prone to spicy outbursts. I was in a meeting just last week with a mask on. And the person that was talking to me could tell I was angry. And I'm like, how? Is it in the eyes? Is it in the eyebrows? Like, what is it? The furrowed brow? Is it all of these things? So even in that moment, and I said it out loud. I go, no, I'm angry. Yes, you are interpreting my nonverbals correctly. I am furious with the information you are giving me, and I'm trying to find a way to process this in a positive way in a very short period of time. So this this is part of the process, but I think being reminded of what does it look like then for us to speak the truth in love, right?
Yeah.
And that's hard. It's really hard.
And that's why just always, this is a reminder of just the humility that it takes. I think that we just oftentimes in today's world are just in echo chambers with a lot of people who think a lot of the same, and this is why it's so important to be in diverse communities and actually in real relationship with real people, because I think there's kind of an ethic that is in our world today that is I just love everybody everywhere, but loving everyone everywhere is a great way to not actually love any real people anywhere. And we need to be in communal spaces where we have to learn to listen, and we have to know that being a Christian means something to you that it might not mean to somebody else, and you need to learn to listen. And sometimes you need to say the challenging thing to somebody and to bring that up and to say this is important that we have this conversation. But that posture of listening and letting that be the thing that you go to instead of speaking, I think is just a really profound thing, because we are just caused to respond all day long, and there's things at times that we need to go, all right, I need to take a minute on this and to let my listening muscle lead instead of my responding muscle at times. And I think that's something that we need to work on, and I know I do personally. So James continues, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongue deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless as this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So James gets right after us again, doesn't let us have much wiggle room. I love what you've said, Charlie, about the metaphors that he uses. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because James, out of a lot of the scriptures that we have, uses a lot of metaphors and similes, and I had an English degree, so forgive me, but I'll give you a brief lesson. Similes are like comparisons to imagery with the use of the phrase like or as. In this case, he uses a simile where he says, it's like looking in a mirror and forgetting what you look like as soon as you turn away. And these kind of images are like things that we see a lot in modern literature. It's like how we speak all the time. And I think that's why it resonates with a lot of us, but here it just helps take this lesson that he already has said, being like, you need to actually do what the scripture says. I don't know what is going on in your mind that you're not doing it. And in putting it in a way that, creating this imagery that just sticks with you. And later in some of the later chapters, he continues using it with ship rudders and fires. And it's really interesting on top of it to see how this section seems to read out of the idea of okay, so I told you to you should be slow to speak, but let me also show you we're at the end of this he starts talking about the tongue, but he talks about what we should be listening to, and that is we should be listening to the word. And this is a part where he actually, it seems like he's clarifying for the first thing. He's I'm going to slow down a second and be I need you to listen to the word, which means you have to do what it says, and by that I mean you need to hear it and not forget it and then do it. I was wow, okay, this is a very interesting breakdown where he's saying that, and it makes me wonder, being in what situations you have to clarify this much. So it seems as like clearly James has had this issue and it's like a pet peeve that he's like, let me go off on this for a hot second. Because, and it's true, like I definitely understand that, where a lot of people like read the scriptures, but they just like, it's not sinking in a way that like you're living out your life in that way, and it is frustrating, and that's where we get a lot of the hypocritical like imagery that's associated with like Christianity these days. It's like, well, a lot of people say this, but then they turn around and do the complete opposite. And I guess we probably should point more people to these passages, because it's like, yeah, it would really probably start clearing out the idea of like we need to be hellfire all the time. It's like, oh, just read a couple verses ahead and then just read into this section where you also need to do what the Bible says. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts. I'm sure there's a lot to pick apart in even these sentences here.
Yeah, definitely. Any responses, Justin?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that there's some really nice connection here between what James is saying and what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 7, starting in verse 15 and taking us through 27, there's this whole section about doing, right? There's a section on not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father, right? This whole section on fruit and bearing good fruit. You know, how do I know what a good tree is? A good tree bears good fruit, right? So there's something that comes out of this. And then almost directly here, leading up to this, as you and I were talking before off camera, this very famous, well-known imagery that Jesus uses about a wise man and building a house and a foolish person and then building a house. But leading up to that, he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise person who builds their house on rock. And this comes at the end of the better part of 2 chapters in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, where Jesus has been talking about this, what the kingdom of God looks like. And he ends it with the one who hears and does. And James picks up on that perfectly and says, we have to do this. We can't just hear it. We have to do it.
And basically, Jesus, I'll let you continue, but Jesus gives us an impossible standard. I mean, that you could, the Sermon on the Mount, you've probably already failed at it 10 to 15 times today, as I have.
The moment I woke up.
Yeah, there's so much there. Like, Jesus is going to tell you, okay, you're going to maybe say, well, I'm not an adulterer and I haven't committed murder, so I'm good. But Jesus says, oh, well, have you been angry today? And he makes it to this level of, this is going to be something that you fail at. And so, yeah, continue your thought, Justin.
Well, I mean, so, but that's just it, right? And it goes back to what we've talked about a couple of times here. So we have this opportunity when reading scripture, right? To be challenged by it, to recognize our failings, to recognize that no, we can't do this alone, and we're not called to, right? James is writing in community, by community, for community. Jesus preaches in community, by community, for community. All of this is community oriented, and yet we think this is somehow a solitary process. It's not. We are baptized into the body, right? We are baptized into a community of believers that comes alongside one another, right? And helps build one another up. So we have this idea that we're being called to do this alone, and we're not. And so either we can be challenged by the difficulty of these words, the difficulty of these teachings to say, I am not being the disciple that I've been called to be. Or we can interpret around them. We can interpret them in such a way that we're not really being challenged. And I love James's challenge. It's painful. It's a hard challenge, right? It highlights my failures. I don't do half of this stuff. And it's not because I don't know. It's because I'm not a very good disciple. Now, grace, forgiveness, love, these things come in. Yes. And I'm thankful for that. But being thankful for God's grace doesn't relinquish my responsibility to be the disciple that Jesus has called me to be. Mm-hmm. And I think James is really just drawing us in, again with hard language, be doers of the word, not hearers who deceive themselves. And that self-deception part is hard, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's that's where it gets painful. Like, well, I'm a good person. I'm doing the right thing. No, you're not.
Mhm.
No, you're not. I know I'm not. I mean, there's no self-deception. I don't think I'm a particularly good person. I'm sorry. I mean, people at home are going, oh, how can you say that about yourself? I'm like, it's just, you know, you live with yourself for 40 some odd years, you get to a point where you're like, hey, you're doing okay, but you're not that great.
You could be better.
Yeah, simmer down. Like, but I think it's that. But I think it's that important thing of continuing to work through this. It's the journey of discipleship as much as the destination. And I think, you know, James really draws us into this really hard space, and I just think that mirror language is really good too. Like,
Yeah, he uses the image of a mirror, which is interesting because for us, a mirror is common. That, you know, we hopefully you have a mirror in your home. Sometimes I might look like I do, but I do. But mirrors in that time, only the wealthy would have had them, so it wouldn't have been common that someone might have looked at a mirror a handful of times in their life of the people who he's writing to, maybe more. Like, but you wouldn't have seen yourself very often, and glass wasn't very common, so you weren't like, you know, walking by the local restaurant. And so it was very uncommon, and oftentimes it would be somewhat distorted. So if you really saw a clear picture of yourself, it happened probably just a few times in your life. And I think that's just interesting to think about, because he's basically saying, like, okay, you know, there's going to be these times when you get a clear picture of yourself, and they might be rare for you. Don't forget it. Like, don't forget it. And I think your point about community is so important, Justin, because I think that one of the spaces that we get the mirror held up to us is community. And I personally have learned a lot from the Enneagram and understanding personality stuff that way. And one of the teachings in the Enneagram is the best thing about you is also the worst thing about you. And I think that's true from a standpoint where there's kind of the way that you see the world and your bent and your personality causes you to think that everybody should have that bent and everybody should look at things in kind of the same way. And it's important to sometimes recognize the weakness in your way of seeing things and the weakness that you have in a given context. And it's in community that we find out stuff that's hard about ourselves, our own limitations, our own weaknesses, sometimes how our own biases can cause hurt and pain in other people. And unfortunately, I've just seen in my career in ministry, when that happens, when there's conflict, what often happens is people will say, oh, I'm not going to be part of this church anymore, then they're going to go find somewhere else. And I always think it's interesting because they probably will run into that same problem again because they haven't been able to like reach a firm conclusion. I'm not saying just go to church and you're like locked in forever. I don't think that's true, but I think there's times through conflicts that we need to say, yeah, I'm part of the problem sometimes, and if I can't own at least a little bit of that, and this moment is a moment for me to hold up a mirror to myself and to like just really contemplate what is it that I'm not doing enough of, what is it that I'm doing poorly. And I think James holds up a mirror very, very easily for us right there at the end of chapter 1, saying, are you spending time with poor people? That's like a yes or no answer. Are you spending time with poor people? And he specifically brings up the lowest of the low in that society, orphans and widows, specifically needed a lot of extra care. But you could fill in the blank of people in our world today, specifically around LA. We will drive home and see people who are in need, and you cannot help everybody everywhere, but I love the concept of do for one what you wish you could do for all, and find ways to be in that space, because I think James just holds that up. It's like, all right, like here it is. Do you spend time in? And for me, I know one thing that I miss greatly right now, and I'm not saying that I'm any better than anybody else, but part of my job is going to serve food at a homeless shelter once a month, and that is always like sanctifying time for me, where some of my conflicts and my problems disappear, and I just get to sit and have a meal with somebody who's down on their luck, and helps me to realize like I'm just one or two situations away from that happening. I know during COVID, my wife works with a lot of food banks and does writing for them, and she said that one thing that's been interesting is people are saying that they're having people who come and say, like, this is the first time I've ever used this. And part of the realization is how corrupt some of these systems are and how hard it is to get help. And so some people are like, wow, this is really more complicated than I thought. It's a little hard. So I think for some of us, we've realized some of the ways that we haven't had to be part of some of these systems that are difficult on people. But I think that's just a mirror right there at the end. Do you spend time around the poor?
Yeah, I mean, James kind of punctuates this section with a few things. You want to know what religion looks like? Watch your mouth. Spend time with the poor and the marginalized. Do justice with those in your community. And be unstained by the world. Don't be like the world. That's hard. I mean, this is it, right? Like, this is getting down to it. This is what discipleship looks like. And it's interesting when some scholars sort of read this and go, well, this feels like a bunch of unconnected or disconnected ideas. Like, no, it comes back to common themes, right? And justice, I think, is one of them. And how we treat one another is one of them. And this, again, this notion of what does community look like. And so I think James, as you and I were talking before, I think James gets slept on. I think this letter gets slept on. I think it gets marginalized for lots of reasons. Maybe because it's hard.
I think we don't want to think about it.
maybe we just don't want to deal with what James is doing here. Maybe that's right. But that's exactly why we should. It's exactly why we should be reading. It's exactly why we should be wrestling with it. Because what he's saying here, I think, is really life-challenging and life-changing.
Well, I think you could argue that, especially since this is likely one of the first books written, like, this to me is some of the purest callings of Christianity. Not changed by anything, or not dealing with specific problems in specific churches that sometimes we don't have the background to understand. He's dealing with issues, obviously, that are rising among early Christians, but it's more broad in that sense. And he's, again, the brother of Jesus, saying, like, no, this is what my brother cared about, and very much echoing, as you said, the Sermon on the Mount, that the old kids' VBS song, "The Wise Man Built His House." What are you going to build your life on? And James is just bringing us back and saying, you can't fake it. Like, sometimes there's going to be stuff that comes up that looks ugly in the mirror, and what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to let it sit there? Are you going to pretend it's not there? Or are you going to say, all right, I want to address that. I want to become more faithful in whatever it is that I think God is calling me to. So unfortunately, that is the time we have today. As we've said, there's a whole lot more that could be said. Thank you to Charlie and to Justin for being part of this conversation. I hope it's been helpful to you. You're welcome to join us for a time of prayer in just a few minutes on Zoom. If you need information on that, you can email me, Brian, with a Y, at glendale.church. Have a great evening.